So Tepe Gawra is one of the most important of these northern Mesopotamian Ubaid sites. It's located on the eastern flank of the Greater Zab River, on the east bank of the Tigris, northwest of modern Mosul. And it's a relatively small site, especially for the Ubaid occupations. But what makes it really fascinating is that it was largely excavated using horizontal techniques. So the older the sediment layers, the less occupation we actually have exposed. But by the time we get to the late Ubaid and into the late Chalcolithic, we actually have on the order of half or 60% of some of these settlements. So we have relatively large spatial exposures, but we also have a continuous sequence that dates all the way back to the Halaf period. And an occupation there to about 6500 BCE. So the excavations here have kind of proven to be the type site for the late prehistory of Mesopotamia. The ceramic sequence in particular here is compared to just about every other archaeological site in the northern Mesopotamian sphere. So it was excavated in the 1920s and 1930s by an American and British archaeological team, and you can kind of see one of these large Ubaid tripartite temples that was found in level 13. Um, Levels 20 or 19 through 17 date to the Halaf period, and levels 16 through 12 date from the Ubaid 3, middle Ubaid to the terminal Ubaid in level 12. There does appear to have been a hiatus between the occupation of Halaf and Ubaid, but some sites in the region are showing what our archaeologists are calling the Halaf Ubaid transitional styles, where we do see some of these communities switching over or beginning to produce both Halaf and Ubaid wares. Beginning in level 16, we see a shift away from the Halaf Tholoi to tripartite architecture and Ubaid style material goods in all of these levels. Now, what makes Tepe Gawra relatively unique is that we have both a settlement and a relatively extensive cemetery with a temple that allows it to be compared to the southern Mesopotamian site at Eridu. This site isn't as large as Eridu. It probably only had a population of maybe 200 or 250 people at its height, but it does show a lot of the same similarities in terms of this architectural layout. So there are 185 burials at the site, 100 of which occur in the latest phase of the Ubaid from level 12. But most of those were children and infant burials who were buried beneath the floors of the houses. And remember, a tradition that we already see at Tel Abada that we saw earlier in the Samaran site at Tel Es Sawan. The later burials from 12, however, the adult burials, do appear to include some objects that Gil Stein and Mitchell Rothman have argued are prestige goods. And these include copper, gold, silver, and polished stones included in the burials. So there may be some evidence for kind of the expansion of these elite institutions. Level 13 is perhaps the most important at the site because it contains this tripartite temple complex, which you can kind of see built here with these large niched facades that are built into the compound. It's niched and buttressed, and it's generally assumed to be a temple based on their layout. But the artifact inventories from the temples are entirely domestic. They consisted of numerous spindle whorls, grinding stones, ceramic vessels, and stone tools. So not unlike the temple at Eridu, we see here the same type of domestic structures and artifacts. To say that at the very least that the temple, even if it is a religious structure, also has an important economic and domestic function as well within the compound. So Tepe Gawra gives us kind of the best comparative to the complex at Eridu, even though we don't see the large population increase that we see associated with it. But we do see something we don't see there in terms of the burials, where we start to see some evidence of social status differentiation. Rothman has talked quite a bit about this in level 12, especially in the context of the White Room, a large tripartite structure that is at the center of the settlement and is much larger than any other households. But if you look at the artifact inventories, objects of gold and silver occur in just about every household, evenly spread out across the site. So it doesn't appear to be a consolidation of resources by whoever's living in the central community. And I think this is where we start to talk about the house itself as an extended metaphor. And this is from the research of David Wingrew. And he essentially argues that in the late Ubaid, tripartite houses become both the framework for domestic life, but as well as the framework for ritual life. And I think this is where we see that kind of carryover into the Uruk and early dynastic period, with tripartite temples serving as religious spaces. So Wingrew argues that the hearth and the altar are metaphorically similar. The hearth as the center of the house, and the way that everyone gathers around it, cooks the food, and provides the sustenance in the house, but the altar represents that in the temple. So he kind of argues that we have a spatial differentiation in the house itself. In the center room, we can kind of see an association of ritual and hospitality and exchange. Whereas in the side rooms, this is where we see our production processes: food, pottery, weaving, caring for children, and storage, and social administration, all occurring in the exterior rooms of the houses. And so the house is, for Wingrew at the same time, a workshop, but it's also a shrine, and it's an office and a household, right? So it is at the same time domestic and ritual. And I think this kind of points back to something we talked about extensively at sites like Chateau Huyuk or even Göbekli Tepe, that the ritual, the idea of a separate space for religious practice, is a very distinct idea that we may not be able to read back into the past, at least not during the Ubaid period. These temples at Tepe Gawra and Eridu may have had a domestic function as well, and so purely calling them a separate sacred space can be somewhat problematic based on what we see in the artifact repertoire. I think Wingrow's idea here of the house as a metaphor is an incredibly poignant one, that it is both ritual and domestic, and those spheres need not be divorced based on our current understanding of Ubaid settlement.